Good morning, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Ripped from the Headlines. This past Friday was Groundhog Day, and Groundhog Day is a great movie. Not so sure about what kind of day it is this year. For those who may have missed the results, Puxatawny did not see his shadow, so we may be in for an early spring. There's also a groundhog named Staten Island Chuck or something like that. He also didn't see it, so I think we're heading into an early spring, which would be great, but probably not true. But Groundhog Day is a great movie starring Bill Murray in terms of things repeating themselves over and over again. It seems like the same day over and over again. For those who haven't seen it, highly recommended. There's been some analysis as to how long theoretically did it take for that movie to play out in terms of, for the character played by Bill Murray to learn all of those things. And some say 10 years, some say 30 years, 40 years. Irrelevant, but I wrote something up for this past Shabbat that the more things change, the more they stay the same. And sometimes it feels like we're seeing the same things over and over again. I mentioned this with regards to the headlines. If anyone follows, for example, Times of Israel, watches the headlines, Israel, responds to rockets fired on Lebanon, or Israeli Air Force bombs Hezbollah, or there just seems to be a lot of the same thing happening over and over again. Of course, our goal is to find each and every day, find something unique. We say every morning when we say Shema, Asher Anochi Mitzavcha Hayom, God commands us today. Today, each and every day should be looked at as if something new can be found. And so there's a little bit of that overplay between Groundhog Day, the movie, and headlines repeating over and over again. And that's because with the subject that we're talking about today, our title is Say It, Don't Spray It, Spitting and Halakhah. The headline that we're going to analyze is one that actually has been mentioned before. I just want to mention that our Torah study this morning, sponsored by Helene and Harvey Kaminsky, in memory of Reuben Partel, Zichrono Livracha. May his neshama have an aliyah, his memory always be for a blessing. So the headline, and there are sources in the chat for those. You just click on the link and you should be able to access those. The source is 2 Jewish Israelis detained for allegedly spitting at Christian cleric in Jerusalem. So this was in the Times of Israel just the other day. This incident happened over the weekend, and let's take a look at the article. 2 Jewish Israelis were detained on Saturday on suspicion that they spat at and insulted a Christian clergyman in the Old City of Jerusalem, police said. Officers said in a statement that the incident had occurred earlier in the day, and the 2 suspects were tracked down a few hours later. One of the suspects was 17 years old. No details were released about the second. Both suspects were placed under house arrest pending further investigation, as police vowed zero tolerance for such incidents. A video of the incident showed Abbot Nicodemus Schnabel walking with the woman who was filming him and herself. The priest says shalom into the camera before being approached by the 2 youths who shout effing Jesus in Hebrew and spit at him. Foreign Minister Israel Katz condemned the ugly incident on Sunday. Under Israeli rule, members of all faiths enjoy total freedom of worship as never has been the case before, he said in a statement. It was the first such reported incident since October, when police said they had marked a significant rise in attacks on Christians in Jerusalem, with 17 incidents reported in the 6 months prior. 5 people were arrested on October 4th on suspicion of spitting at Christians during Sukkot events in the Old City. The suspects were arrested concerning 2 separate incidents that happened over the holiday. Though no incidents have been reported in the intervening 4 months, Israel's war with Hamas, which began on October 7th, has overshadowed many other domestic issues in the country. The incidents over Sukkot were strongly condemned by Israeli leaders, including Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who called them sacrilege and simply unacceptable, and Chief Rabbi David Lau, who said they were unwarranted. At the time, Eitamar Ben-Gvir and religious Zionist Party MK Simcha Rothman both said that the attacks were wrong, but that the reaction to them was blown out of proportion. I think spitting at Christians is not a criminal case, Ben-Gvir said in an interview at the time. Not everything justifies an arrest. It's unfortunate that phenomena that are fully worthy of condemnation were blown out of proportion, echoed by police, Simcha Rothman told Ynet news site. So that's what took place a couple of days ago. That's what took place several months ago. I will admit that when compiling a list of topics for Rip from the Headlines, this topic has been on my list since back in the fall when these events emerged. And I was talking with a colleague who actually gave a shiur on this topic over Sukkot because of it being in the news. And of course, a lot has been knocked off out of the headlines, and things have been very different since October 7th, with the focus on the war with Hamas. So here's the event. I think for the most part, spitting, it has a kind of a very ugly, insulting, gross type of behavior. Although in baseball it seems pretty regular in terms of chewing and spitting. But we see what was the basic reaction. Look, the perpetrators are arrested, being investigated. You have the prime minister saying it's terrible, or chief rabbi saying it's terrible. You have some pushback by those who think that, well, it's bad, but it doesn't warrant an arrest. But then, if you go back to October, there was a post on social media that was reported in the Jerusalem Post, source number 2, that no, it's a Jewish custom to spit at Christians. This is back in October 3rd. The custom of spitting near churches or monasteries is an ancient Jewish tradition. Far-right activist Elisha Yered wrote on Monday in response to a video of Orthodox Jews spitting on Christian pilgrims. Former spokesman for MK Limor San Harmelech of the far-right Otzma Yehudit Party said that there's even a blessing that Jews are supposed to say when seeing a church. Blessed is he who has patience for those who violate his will, which Yered described as a blessing that praises God for not immediately punishing idol worshippers for their wicked deeds. He says about a blessing on a church, what comes to my mind is there a blessing for the czar from Fiddler on the Roof? Everyone remember that blessing? And may the Lord keep the czar far away from us. But so you have some reaction in a religious reaction that no, this is there's a tradition, and there's even a bracha to say when seeing a church. So those are the headlines a couple of days ago, a couple of months ago. This type of behavior, reactions, questions, comments before we look at some of those sources, including investigating that comment of Elisha Yered. Okay, so let's dig a little bit into this topic. So
just the sources, please. Excuse me for interrupting. I don't have them.
Got to come on time.
Okay.
So Yered says that there was it's an ancient Jewish tradition to spit, and he says there's a bracha on the church. So the ancient Jewish tradition, spitting, well, maybe have to define ancient, but that does not have a Talmudic precedent. But the bracha that he references about a bracha on a church does have a Talmudic reference. The Gemara in Brachos 57b, source number 3, the sages taught, one who sees the idol called Markulis, translated as Mercury, recites, "Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who has shown patience to those who violate his will." The idea that what kind of patience? Well, since each and every day they're offering the way they worship this Markulis, this Mercury, is with offerings. Well, each day that they were able to exist, God had some forbearance and allowed this to take place. So it must be that God has some patience if this idol, this Mercury, this Markulis remains in existence. Then one who sees a place in which idolatry was eradicated should recite, "Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who eradicated idolatry from our land. And just as it was eradicated from this place, so too may be eradicated from all places of Israel, and restore the hearts of their worshipers to worship you." So that's an extended bracha and prayer and aspiration to eliminate idolatry when you see a place where idolatry was uprooted in Israel. Outside of Eretz Yisrael, one need not recite and restore the hearts of their worshipers to worship you. You can leave out that part of the bracha, since it's predominantly populated by Gentiles, right? In Israel, the hope is that it's a Jewish land with Jewish inhabitants, and mostly Jewish inhabitants, so we want those Jewish inhabitants to be worshiping God and not idols. Outside of Israel, we can't really have these high, lofty aspirations for the Gentile population. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar said, even outside of Israel, one is required to recite that formula because in the end of the days, all nations will convert. As it is stated, for then I will turn to people of pure language, they may all call upon the name of the Lord to serve him with one consent. Sophania 3:9. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says, why give up on the Gentiles in the diaspora? One day everyone's going to convert. So if you see a place where idolatry has been uprooted, say the blessing, include the aspiration that the Gentile leave their idolatrous ways, and therefore all will turn their hearts to the one true Lord. This is the Talmudic precedent. That's the bracha that Yered is referencing. And we have to unpack it a little bit because we know that anytime we reference things relating to idolatry, most of us, certainly in North America, don't encounter much genuine idolatry in the Talmudic form, nothing like Mercury or the types of idolatries described in the Bible. We encounter other religions. We encounter Christianity. We encounter Islam. Maybe the Eastern religions, which are growing in popularity, but still, we don't have this. We don't have as many people taking rocks and bowing down to them and calling those rocks their deities. And so it becomes, part of that is also into that equation, as mentioned by the Talmud, by the sages, as well as the view of Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. What would their view be about today? Or even in those times, what would their view be? You get a sense that the sages felt that in Israel we can have aspirations for a majority monotheistic environment, while outside of Israel you shouldn't really expect it. The Jews are the minority. Or Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says, no, even outside of Israel, you can hope for monotheism. And as religion has changed since the times of the Talmud, with the advent and growth of Christianity and certainly the development of Islam, that certainly has changed the monotheistic outlook all over the world. A couple of reactions I had to this, the Talmud, certainly with Rav Shimon ben Elazar, who's concerned about the non-Jews outside of Israel, is the idea of the Noachide movement. Right? We mentioned before, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, the late Lubavitcher Rebbe, one of his campaigns was a Noachide campaign, so that the non-Jews should recognize the 7 Noachide commandments as that is their spiritual heritage, to have a monotheistic approach. Christianity may have pieces of it, but really it's about promoting the Noachide mitzvos and obligations, and so that's really in the keeping of Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, who says, no, why give up on the non-Jews outside of Israel? Then you also have, with regard to the concept of idolatry, what are the other religions? We've spoken a little bit about, we talked about a similar blessing about conquering territory that was controlled by non-Jews with regards to what's taking place in Gaza. We had the share about putting mezuzahs up in Gaza a couple of weeks ago. But here, with regards to the religion of the non-Jew in our midst, how does that work with regards to Christianity? Right? Islam is a monotheistic faith, and essentially a lot of the conversation about idolatry does not transfer over into Islam. But Christianity, with its trinity, is something that doesn't look as purely monotheistic and does introduce certain complications, and that will impact how we look at this Talmudic statement as through the prism of practical Jewish law. All right, so basically, there's nothing yet about spitting, but there is this idea of when you see a church or a house of worship or idolatrous practice, there's a blessing to be recited, recognizing God's patience and hoping for a proper direction of the hearts of the worshipers, certainly in Israel, maybe in the diaspora. How do we paskin? What is the official policy, the halachic decision on this issue? Source number 4, Shulchan Aruch Orach Chaim 224:1, that if someone sees the markolis or sees other idolatry, you say the bracha, who has patience, and if you see it within 30 days, if you keep seeing it day after day, you don't say another bracha. It's only after if you haven't seen it in 30 days. So the Shulchan Aruch says, yeah, this is an appropriate practice. Haga, the Rama, the Ha'idna, nowadays, ein mevarchim zos habracha shari anu migudalim beinehem viroim oso tamid. No, we don't say this bracha nowadays. Why? Because we are completely surrounded by them. We live among them, and we always see it, so there's no need for the bracha. And so there's an analysis as to how do we understand the Ramah? Is the Ramah saying the idolatry has changed, so you don't have the same idolatry, so you don't have the same bracha? Is it that maybe you said it once, but you're seeing them every day, so there's no 30-day intervals? And this sets off a discussion as to what does the Ramah mean? Is the Ramah saying the bracha is no longer relevant altogether? So Rabbi Yaakov Chaim Sofer, the author of the Kaf HaChaim, source number 5, quotes a view that essentially limits the Talmudic teaching and the halachic practice by saying dafka, it's in the bolded words of source number 5, dafka markolis. It was only mercury. It was only that specific idolatrous practice that the Talmud was talking about. Nowadays, we don't have this type of idolatrous practice surrounding us, so therefore there's no blessing. So, the blessing invoked by Yered to try and dismiss some of the negative behavior of those who were spitting at Christian pilgrims back in October. It's an ancient practice we have yet to see, but we're somewhat dismissive of non-Jewish religious practices as seen from the bracha is not necessarily 100% accurate, because maybe it's understood the fact that we don't have, it was only that specific practice that the Talmud mentions. Whether it's influenced culturally by the fact if you live in a Christian land like the Ramah, right, you could argue that the Shulchan Aruch was not living amongst Christians the same way. Rabbi Yosef Karo was more Spain, Egypt, Israel, more of an Islamic influence. So if you encounter real idolatry, you would do it. So unclear, but there's definitely a change in how we view the idolatry around us. And the bracha, while having been introduced, is not something that has as much practical value. Certainly for Ashkenazim living amongst Christians, and even Rabbi Yaakov Sofer says it was only introduced for that specific practice and no more. In general, there's a certain antipathy, religiously, culturally, that Jews have towards churches, right? Going back to Fiddler on the Roof, the dark, foreboding music playing as Golda goes to see. She has to go see the father to find out what happened to her daughter, and she learns about what happened to little Chavala marrying outside the faith. But even more, people have stories of crossing the street when walking by a church. Some of that may be lingering antipathy that emerged from these sources, or some of it was, practically speaking, right, that the non-Jewish kids beat up the Jewish kids. So there was a little bit of self-preservation that might be able to scaffold around this initial practice, which may have fallen out of being religiously binding, but certainly still had a cultural play, a cultural aspect to it as well. So we covered the bracha. Now let's pivot towards the spitting. I saw someone address this subject by titling the presentation "Great Expectorations." I thought that was cute, play on introducing it, but he already took it, so I used something else. So what about spitting? All right, so spitting has a couple of places it appears in Jewish law. One we're not going to explore at great depth, has to do with what happens if you taste food and then spit it out. And this is relevant for whether or not you make a bracha beforehand, whether or not if you taste chicken soup on Friday afternoon, you become fleshik, whether it's considered still fasting if you spit it out before swallowing it. All right, so that's more of the, I call that a little bit more the reactive spitting. You're not spitting because you want to spit. You're spitting because of the circumstance. You don't want to be fleshik. You're just tasting. You're fasting, something and the like. But there is an element of proactive spitting that appears in Talmud and Jewish law, and that starts with source number 6. Source number 6, Shulchan Aruch and Yoredeya, and it has a little bit of relevance to our parsha, Parshat Mishpatim. The first aliyah ends with the famous directive about v'rapo yirapeh, about healing the person who was wounded, who was hurt. And the idea of medicine being part of the Jewish tradition starts right over there, the idea of the Jewish doctor, as well as the fact that we know that people were very superstitious and sometimes took on different practices that were strange, incantations, formula, amulets, and the stuff. And it's within that context that the Shulchan Aruch is describing someone, source 6, again, who whispers spells over a wound or over someone ill, and then spits, and then reads a verse from the Torah. This person has no portion in the world to come. So it's basically, the Shulchan Aruch is describing a formula or a process, as mentioned in the Talmud, of how Gentiles would try and heal the wounds. Then if you do that, you have no portion of the world to come. But even if they do not spit, it is still prohibited. So even if you want to go through the hocus pocus mumbo jumbo formula and you don't spit, it's still a problem. But if there's danger to life, then anything is permitted. Now, if the person is hanging on the edge of death, you can try anything and everything, because who knows what type of thing will have an impact. Right? This of course is relevant to the discussion. Also, part of this area of the Shulchan Aruch. Right? You can obviously feed someone non-kosher food to make them well. You can violate the Shabbos. The only thing you're not allowed to violate are the big three, right? Idolatry, adultery, and murder. And what's taking place here is inappropriate behavior, inappropriate non-Jewish behavior, but it's not considered idolatry. It's kind of interesting because it does make a distinction that it could be viewed as idolatrous and impact your share in the world to come, unless it's for pikuach nefesh. Right? If it's pikuach nefesh, we don't consider idolatry, because if it was idolatry, then you wouldn't be able to do it to save a life, because you're not allowed to violate idolatry to save a life. And this relates to all sorts of different things. We tried to share before about going into a church to save a life, et cetera, et cetera. But the key piece for us right here is that the spitting seems to round out the practice, right? Because it says if you do this and you spit, you have no portion of the world to come, and if you don't spit. So it seems like the spitting is what ties the whole thing together to turn it into a foreign, problematic practice. So the Taz, Rabbi David Siegel, explains on the Shulchan Aruch source number 7, and the Hebrew will translate it, right? What's going on with the rokeik, v'achar kore, you're spitting and reciting. So he says, Kivin demaskir shem shamayim al harakika have bizayon chas v'shalom. Since basically you're spitting and then invoking a pasuk with God's name, it's very inappropriate to spit when you say God's name. It's a denigration of God. It's a bizayon. Al kain, and that's why he says spitting, when it is connecting to denigrating God's name, when it's viewed as a denigration, is problematic. But don't ask about mashino hagin birakika kodem vanachnu korim. Don't ask a question about a practice which exists, or those who have the custom to spit before they say the words "Vanachnu korim in Aleinu." Desham hakol yodin sharakika hi lebizayon hagilulim shalovdei kochavim. Yikavod shemayim shemazkir achar kach. There, the spitting is to denigrate the foreign worship which you reference, and afterwards you're transitioning and pivoting into glorifying God. Ken Nirali, that's my view. All right, so we have a practice, some form of healing practice that involves spitting that really tips the balance into being problematic. And it's problematic because it's a kind of a chil Hashem, it desecrates God's name. But within the context of discussing this, the Taz references a practice of spitting during Aleinu. And so what's he talking about? So Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, late Lubavitcher Rebbe, in the book Hayom Yom, that was compiled with different practices of Chabad, says, in the prayer beginning Aleinu, source 8, the wording that we customarily follow is, they bow to vanity and nothingness. The words are Shehem Mishachavim Lahevel Varik. The version is also used in the Musaf prayers of Rosh Hashanah. It's also part of the Aleinu there. And he points out that we make a point of not saying, and they pray to a God who does not answer. The expression that some of us may be used to seeing, and this is a larger conversation in the Aleinu prayer, it's usually said in some prayer books, like the old Birnbaum prayer book, it's not even there at all. In the Art Scroll prayer book and the Koren prayer book, it's in parentheses, where we say, Aleinu l'shabeach ladon hakol. we're praying to the master of all. We're giving glory to the creator of heaven and earth. He didn't create us like the other nations, and our lot portion is not like their portion. Our lot is not like theirs. And then usually we say, we bow before the Lord. But that insertion is, they bow to worthlessness and nothingness. They pray to a God who does not answer. And then so the Rabbi Schneerson is pointing out two things. One, he says the language is shehem meshachrim lehevel varik. They bow to nothingness, but you leave out the second half, and they pray to a God who is not worshipped, and that is what's called the Nusach Ari. That is the Isaac Luria's language, his text. So it has half of the prayer, but then he points out it is customary to spit after reciting the above phrase. We spit after saying shehem meshachrim lehevel varik. The reason is that speaking generates saliva, and we do not wish to benefit from the saliva generated by uttering such words. We just invoke idolatry, and there may be a little saliva that was generated in our mouths by talking about idolatry, so we want to spit it out. Now, what's left unsaid is that, how do you say spit in Hebrew? Rok. Rok. Shem shachlim lehevel varik. Right? It kind of fits that linguistically. We're talking about the non-Jews worshiping nothingness to a God who does not answer, and we're saying the word rik, rok, it kind of all fits together, right? The whole generating the saliva that we want to get rid of, since it's connected to idolatrous mention, that kind of provides a little bit more of a halachic-based explanation, or a more legalistic explanation. But linguistically, right? You spit because that's what they're doing. And if anyone has ever been in a place where this is the practice, certainly if you've been in a Chabad shul, this is often the practice. Whether or not people make a lot of noise when they do it, or try to do it without anybody noticing, depends on I guess the manners, or the culture of the person who is expectorating. But this is where it comes from. It's something that's in the Jerusalem Post article here, it says an ancient practice. It depends how you define ancient. Certainly 300-400 years ago, this was something that existed, of there being some spitting taking place during Aleinu. And this is the idea of the way we show our disdain for the idolatrous practices. Now, then we could open up a whole discussion. What happened to this verse? The verse was put into parentheses. It was omitted. The idea of saying it out loud, if there are non-Jews present, was it censored? Right? The bowing, they pray, worship a God who does not answer. Does that apply to whom? Does that apply to Christians? Well, they worship God. It's not fully monotheistic. So there's a whole discussion. And suffice it to say, for a very long time, certainly in many Western European circles, Jewish circles, the verse was omitted, or entirely, or was put in parentheses. I would say, as in Israel, where that wasn't always a practice, it's less so in parentheses. As we've had a more aggressive, muscular, proud Jewish culture, it was brought back into the recitation. I always think it's very interesting here at the Jewish Center of Atlantic Beach. Like most modern Orthodox shuls, when Aleinu is recited out loud, it's not included. However, the kids, when they're in school, they do say it out loud. So when the kids are leading Aleinu, it's always very interesting to watch them as they're singing Aleinu. Then they start going Shehem Shachav, and then recognize that the congregation has passed by them, because that's not the way we sing it publicly. And it's sometimes can be the disagreement, the old school, the new school, but this is where it comes from. Clearly, that expression was found in the Aleinu. There were those who spat at that time, and the spitting has to do with our disagreement, wanting to separate ourselves from to show our disdain for idolatrous practices, idolatrous worship. or to even avoid having that saliva remain in our mouth, as Rabbi Schneerson mentions.
That always made me cringe, that line. And it's a self-conscious, but and
Right?
rape it means
Yeah.
empty. Rape.
So it makes you cringe when we say it about them.
Yeah, of course. Just to even.
No, look, I still, look, as I mentioned, so culturally, sociologically, it was pretty much out of the modern Orthodox liturgy, until Art Scroll brought it back. Art Scroll brought it back in parentheses. At the same time, but once it's back on the page, this always, not always, this often comes up on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, because what happens on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur? Right, usually on Shabbos, first off, modern Orthodox synagogues might not be as many people in shul. And when they sing Aleinu out loud, it pretty much has been absent from the singing of Aleinu out loud. People are not saying it. They just do it the old-fashioned way with the old school tune. Have to look up. We talked about sometimes the origins of tunes. Where does this tune come from? Right, Shalom, Chalkeinu Kohen Vigor Aleinu Kechol Hamonam Vanachnu Korim Ushachavim Umodi. Right, no one says the other way is you got to do another one of those lines musically. But on Rosh Hashanah, when more people are in shul and more people are noticing it, and it's a serious day. That's sometimes when people's hackles are up about it, including that line or not. Also, it impacts the way Aleinu, the solemnity of the day. Right, we're praying to Adon HaKol, the Master of All. It's part of the Malchiot section of God's kingship. We bow. People go down to they kneel, and they're paying a lot more attention. Also, because of the fact that the Ark is open during Aleinu, and for anyone who has followed, anyone who's ever been a gabbai or a rabbi, or the person opening the Ark for that section, or the synagogue official on the bima, then it's always very tricky because you open the Ark for Aleinu, and then when you start saying you close it when you reference the non-Jews, and then you open it up again when you say Vanachnu Karu Mishachim, when you bow. And so, whether the Chazan is pressure on the Chazan to say it, to not say it, it's quite a reminder of the fact that this is still an issue within the liturgy. And whether to bring it back again or not, might be the subject for another conversation. So, for some, it's the idea makes for some it makes the rest. It makes it, as was mentioned, cringe a little bit. For some, the whole idea that the people be spitting in shul is kind of gross, right? That's that might be the cringy part of all of this, and. So the concept of spitting in the synagogue is talked about, just the concept. What if someone spits in synagogue? Culturally, many synagogues until into the 20th century had spittoons in the synagogue, and you can go online. I think that some of the synagogues in the Lower East Side that were turned into museums have them on display. People have told me anecdotally of other congregations that had spittoons because that was just the way. That was more common. So the Shulchan Aruch talks about spitting in general to point out that it's not a prohibited activity. Right? Is it cringy? Does it seem gross to us? Maybe, but source number 9, Shulchan Aruch, and talking about the synagogue, one may spit in the synagogue as long as you rub it out with your feet, or if there are reeds there that if you spit into them, it will not be visible. So you can have spit, but you just, people shouldn't have to look at the spit. Hence, you have to have reeds to cover it up, or rub it out with your feet, or later on have a spittoon. Mishnah Berurah, be careful not to spit in front of your friend who will be disgusted by it. Right? It's certainly the way people will respond impacts this law. And the Arizal was careful not to spit. Rabbi Isaac Luria, the Kabbalist, would not spit in the synagogue, which is interesting because the Hasidim are the ones who are spitting with regard to that one line. I'm not sure if it necessarily doesn't have to be consistent throughout, but it's just interesting to note. All right. So what about the saliva? So if you spit, you have to cover it up, you can't be doing it to gross other people out. Maybe it's not, the most couth thing to do, but it's allowed. You rub it out. Shulchan Aruch introduces a problem with rubbing it out when it comes to the laws of Shabbat. Source number 11. One is forbidden to rub saliva on the ground with his foot because he's smoothing the crevices. Right? One of the things you're not allowed to do on Shabbos is smooth out something that's rough. And let's face it, the likelihood is that the synagogue floors 400 or 500 years ago weren't necessarily as smooth as ours are. Some of them may have even been dirt. And if you spit and then you want to smooth out this, you want to cover the spit and smooth it and rub it into the floor, what are you violating? You're smoothing the crevices and you could be violating Shabbos. However, one may step on it in a mindless fashion as his intention is not to smooth the crevices, even though it will happen, is nevertheless permitted because it is repulsive. Right? We said you're allowed to spit, but it shouldn't be repulsive, so you have to cover it up. If you cover it up the normal way with your foot, you may be violating Shabbos, so just do it in a little bit more of an indirect way, in a mindless fashion, just like shuffle your feet around and cover it up. And even though this might have the same possibility of violating the Shabbos at the end result, it doesn't fall into a full mindful, complete violation of Shabbat, and we're going to let you do this in the indirect fashion because it is repulsive, it is gross. Okay, so that is the Shulchan Aruch. So, Rabbi Yosef Karo, 16th century. We have, the idea of spitting in the synagogue was not considered an absolutely forbidden activity. It's repulsive. You have to cover it up, and the like. So the Magen Avram. So now we're getting into the 19th century, right? Magen Avram by Avram Gombiner, one of the commentators on the Shulchan Aruch, right? Sorry. We're now not into the 1800s, with the late 1600s. So this is a couple, 150, 200 years after the Shulchan Aruch is commenting on with regards to what the Shulchan Aruch said about you're not allowed to you're allowed to do this because it is repulsive. So the Shulchan Aruch says, source number 12, Magen Avram, Ha'idna leka dekapid barok mishum miyisusa yizaher shelo yishafshef kishedore salam. He says, well, look, nowadays, people don't care so much. It's not so gross anymore. So therefore, the Shulchan Aruch allows you to kind of shuffle your feet and cover up the spit with the dirt. He says you got to be very careful not to shuffle your feet in any type of way that will be rubbing. He says spit is not really so gross, but phlegm, or that comes out of the nose or the mouth, that is still gross. So it's, sorry to talk about bodily fluids here, but you have spit, you don't want to leave it out there. It's gross. Magen Avram, spit's not so gross. Other types of things are grosser. So you have this, there's a continuum. Now, I think it's gross. We got rid of the spittoons. We're making progress. I think this idea of anyone spitting, even for Aleinu, has fallen by the wayside, except in those communities that have always maintained the practice. But you see that the idea of spit if it's gross, it has to be avoided. It may have been done. It's not prohibited to spit in a shul. If people are bothered by it, Mishnah says obviously you shouldn't do it in front of them. If you do it, it has to be covered. Even on Shabbos, we find a way of covering it because it's gross. But we see that there may be a threshold tolerance, certainly in the end of the 17th century, that's a little bit more okay with spit. Fast forward into our times, Rabbi Eliezer Melamed in his Pinine Halakhah, when he says that Yesh l'chaber es beis hakneses l'nakoso tamid, we should respect the synagogue and clean it constantly. V'tzarich l'nakoses hana'alayim min abuzin le'shechnasim, so you have to clean off the shoes of mud before you enter it. V'asa l'chanes ezocha b'rosh megula, you should enter a synagogue with the head covered. Kamuvan she'asor lirok b'socho, and it should be self-understood that it's forbidden to spit inside it. There was a time, that when the houses were not carpeted or with formal floors and people would spit, then it was permissible to spit in shul. Nowadays, people don't spit in their own homes. L'chen yeshno isur gamur lirot b'beis hakneses. Now there's an absolute prohibition from spitting in the shul. So clearly, Rabbi Melamed has wrapped up the whole discussion and said, look, there may have been more tolerance in the 17th century. There may have been more spitting, throughout the ages when the floors weren't as finished. But let's face it, nowadays, the spitting doesn't fly, and would not be appropriate. So, I think we've covered a topic which started with some very significant, hateful, and clearly outside of the boundary behavior. Certainly spitting at a person has no source whatsoever. We do see a certain, ambivalence and antipathy towards idolatry in Israel, maybe even beyond it, with the hopes that it disappear, and a recognition that there is a invocation of God's name with a blessing in some situations. Things may have shifted in terms of the fact that we don't have idolatry the same way anymore. And when it comes to spitting, there is the idea. Spitting does seem to be a practice to separate ourselves from idolatry and not wanting to make it seem as if we're accepting it within the context of our prayer by separating the line about idolatry from God with spitting that existed in some communities. Nevertheless, that seems to not be very widespread, and spitting, which may have had a little bit more patience and tolerance for in certain eras in our own, is not the appropriate behavior for a shul, let alone anywhere else as well. So as the title of the presentation is, say it, don't spray it. When it comes to halacha, spitting is not the way to go.